Greetings, class. This is your instructor. I am here to go over the Stephanie Coontz essay that we've read for class. First of all, I hope you guys are doing well and being safe. Generally, what I do to start this essay is that I do a survey and I ask students when would they want to be born, what generation, and a lot of students choose between 2000 and 2020. And you can see why. We have amazing technology. Some of the best technology in human history is right now. We have cell phones, we have computers. It's a really an amazing time to be alive. And in terms of equality, I would say we still have a long way to go, but compared to other generations in America, we have come a long way. Some students choose the 1990s, particularly for music, sports, Michael Jordan, things like that. Only a handful of people choose the 1980s, 70s. The 60s are a pretty big selection for students. Being college students, I can understand why. And then 1950s usually have a couple students. And after that, nobody really chooses to be born in the 40s or 30s, especially the 30s. Sometimes I have students who'd want to be around in the 20s. But usually the 60s, 90s, 2000s win. But what I find interesting is they did the same survey in our essay, and they found out that most people would want to be around in the 1950s. And in American history, it was a time of decadence. A lot of people had money, I've mentioned in class, but during this time, you had one person who could afford a house, afford a family of 5, afford basically all the basic necessities they would need. And today you have 2 people and it's hard to afford one of those things. I'm going to go over some key points from the essay, but one of which would be on page 19. Divorce was relatively low in the 1950s. Before that, divorce was high, especially in the 1930s, 1940s. But in terms of getting married, families staying together, the 1950s is a pretty good time. Also, it's kind of interesting, but they had a lot of teen pregnancy in the 1950s, which is a bit strange because the rates were super high. However, they had a different mentality back in the 1950s, and that is if you're a teenager and you got pregnant, you were going to get married. So it was a big deal for them, but a lot of people, they were getting married at 18. That's what they were expected to do. Today, if you get pregnant at 18 or 16, you might look at the person and say, there's no way I'm going to be with you. And the family could say, yes, we don't want that person in our life at all. However, in the 1950s, they were saying, if we get pregnant, we're going to stay together. We're going to try to do this for the family. Another really interesting point from this essay that I think would work really well for an essay is this. I think the American dream of retirement, I think that's a great paper topic. And yet they do talk about this. So in the 1940s, Americans came back from the war and to really summarize things, they started having children. They hadn't seen their wives in a long time, and we had what was called the baby boom. And out of the baby boom came this mentality that what we have to do is we have to focus on the family. We have to focus on the children. And before that, like other countries around the world, you would have grandma and grandpa and great-grandma. They'd all be living together. Like we see in places like Asia, Latin America. The United States was like that as well. But in the 1950s, what happened was that the mom and dad started saying, you know what, we don't have time to focus on our parents. We need to put all of our energy and resources in our children. So that's during the time that you saw a lot of the elderly going to nursing homes, which has been a big movement in our culture today. So I think that's pretty important in our chapter. That's something to look at. And that's been a real shift in America. That's where we are. And it's interesting to note we used to be more like other countries. Another key point from this chapter, I really like page 23. And a couple weeks ago, we watched a video on the corporate income tax and how it was down to 25%. If you're looking at page 23, the federal income tax on the rich during that time was 87%. So the tax are being the rich were being taxed at 87%, and the corporate tax was at 52%. So there's a lot that goes into this math, and I don't want to undermine that at all. Interest rates were a lot higher at that time, but if you look at it carefully, the rich were getting taxed a lot more, and essentially what that did was it created a lot more wealth in terms of our economy, and I think that point matches up really well with the Coontz essay that we read. Another thing, the government was investing a lot into highways. A lot of GIs, they were coming back from war, and they could go to college for free or cheap. So the government was doing a lot of incentives to boost our economy. And another key point, probably my favorite part of the entire chapter that I find most astonishing, is on page 24. It says, it took a factory worker 1 day to earn enough money to pay the closing costs on a new Leventon house selling for $10,000. So you could buy a house for $10,000 back then, right? And you could work 1 day. Imagine going to work 1 day and saying, you know what? I just paid off the closing costs of my house. And by 1991, such a home was selling for $100,000 or more, and it took a factory worker 18 weeks to earn enough money to earn just the closing costs. So it went from, if you think about it, it looks like this. So in the 1950s, you could go to work for 1 day and have the closing costs paid off on your house, right? And then in 1991, it would take 18 weeks. 18 weeks, a year and a half, essentially, to pay off the closing costs of your house. Now, houses then were $100,000. And you could get them cheaper, but $100,000. Now, if you think about it, a house in San Diego is $590,000 to $600,000. And it would probably take years, and I don't know the math because you guys know that's not my specialty, but it would take years and years to pay off the closing costs of your house today. So essentially what this chapter is saying is that there is more financial stability. Yes, they raised the minimum wage. Essentially, you could work at McDonald's and afford a family, which is crazy. There's no way you could do that today. However, there was more wealth in the economy. They raised the minimum wage to meet inflation. There were a lot more incentives for people, and there was a lot more money to be spread around. And that's really the argument of the essay. And there's one other thing to mention about this chapter, and it's more towards the end. I think that we have this nostalgia for the 1950s, but one thing to make clear is that this period was only a great time for a select amount of people. If you're a woman, this was not a fun time to be alive. And also, if you're a minority, if you're African American, if you're Latino, if you're gay, this was a very challenging time to be alive. So in terms of the 1950s, the core of it, the benefits was there was a lot of focus on family, and there was more economic mobility. And I like this chapter, and I think it would work really well in your essays because it provides a lot of history that you need to provide in your second paragraph, particularly if you want to get into nursing homes, retirement. This would be a great chapter for you. If you want to talk about housing, this could be a great chapter to do. And there's other segments in this chapter as well, but I hope this clarifies some key points from this chapter. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at bprown@yahoo.com. Thank you. Bye.